Nathan, do you know that most of your poems are in the form of butt plugs?
Hi everyone, welcome back to Poetology. Today's interview is with Nathan Evans, the author of Homography, which has just launched with Incandescent. Nathan was one of the contributors to the issue of Magma that I co-edited. You can watch a video about this above. In this interview, we talk about queer communities, writing, and owning a small press. I hope you enjoy the interview, and I'll see you at the end. Hi, Nathan.
Hello. Hi.
So nice to have you.
Very nice to be asked.
We are going to talk about your latest poetry collection, Homography, which has
Mhm.
just come out with Incandescent. I was at the launch, was it 2 weeks ago now?
It was 2 weeks ago. Yeah.
At the Poetry Cafe, which was a really lovely event, by the way. I'd like to talk about it, but first, it's not your first book. You've written quite a few things, so can you tell us what you've written before and how you got to Homography?
Oh, how long have you got? Writing's something I've always done since I was a kid, but it was never really the focus for a while. So I studied fine art. I did a foundation course before I went off to do my fine art degree. And my tutor, Catherine, who's actually mentioned in the book, in the Jarman poem in the book, I remember her saying to me, I think the writing is at the center of everything that you're doing. But she was right in that, as in many other things. She was, well, she's still around actually. We've been back in touch recently. She's a fantastic woman. When I went to do my degree, I went to the Ruskin in Oxford, and I specialised in performance art and video. So there was some writing involved in creating performances. And then when I got to town, when I moved to London, it's kind of hard to put on performances and make films without the resources of a university around you. And so I ended up focusing on the writing because it's free, basically. You just need a paper and pen, or a laptop, or whatever to do it. But I was working with writing for performance specifically. So I joined the Royal Court Young Writers Group, the Royal Court Theatre in Sloane Square in London. They had a fantastic writing group. It was the late 90s. It was sort of after that wave of Sarah Kane and Mark Ravenhill and all of the kind of that sort of upcoming edgy stuff had sort of come out, and it was quite an exciting time to be there. And I learned loads of great stuff, certainly about narrative writing there. I didn't have any great success in theatre. So after doing that for a while, I ran off to join the cabaret. I worked with Ducky quite a lot. And I was still writing up, but I was writing for myself to perform shows. And from there, migrated back into theatre. And I was writing film scripts as well. So I've written a lot of screenplays and plays alongside. And then eventually I came back into writing plays. The first book, so poetry was always something that I had done when I wasn't busy doing some other things. And I think it was about 2015, I had collected a whole load of random jottings, which I plonked down in front of Justin, who's my partner at Incandescent, and we were partners in life as well at that point. And he said, I think we could do something with this. And so we did. Well, I applied for an Arts Council grant to produce a book, which was his photography and my poetry. So the poems were set within Justin's photographs. So we got an Arts Council grant to produce that first book, which was called Threads. And also I got some mentorship as part of that. So Katrina Naomi mentored me in the writing of the poems. I'd never had any mentorship. I'd never really put any focus on the poetry at all by that point. And that was how Incandescent began. We began by creating our own book. And then after that, the next book that was published was Swan Song, which was a play that was published. Again, that was an Arts Council funded project. That play eventually became the novella One Last Song, which was another of my books later. And then Canute was published, which was my second poetry collection. So Threads only has 30 poems in it, and those were gathered over 20 years, really. So there's some very early stuff in there that was reworked, whereas Canute was written in a couple of years. And if I'm honest, I think that sometimes shows in the writing. And there's some very strong stuff in there as well. And there's some stuff that maybe could have been edited out, I feel, retrospectively. But anyway, that was published just before lockdown. So it kind of disappeared, really, because I didn't really have any chance to promote it. And that was quite an eco-poetry focused volume. Then there was nothing for quite a while. It was lockdown, but lockdown allowed me to do quite a lot of writing. I know different people had different experiences of lockdown, but for me, I was quite fortunate in where I live. Certainly during the first lockdown, there was great weather. So I used it as an opportunity. I had the self-employed support grant. So I was able to spend much more time than I normally would writing. So I wrote a short story collection first, even though it was published second, and then the novella One Last Song. So those came out in 2024 and 25, and then that brings us up to Homography, which was just published this year.
Right, lovely. And what inspired you to write Homography, and how did it come about? How long did you spend on it?
Canute was finished in 2018 and published in 2019. So it's 7 years between that and Homography. And I think that also shows in the writing, in that Homography has developed over a longer period of time. So in 2020, again, just before lockdown, I joined a group called King's Poets, which has absolutely nothing to do with the monarch and everything to do with King's Cross, which is where they meet. I'd say that was quite transformational in my writing as well, in that it's a feedback poetry group, so we feedback on each other's work. And so Homography was developed through that group. And it's not the only stuff. So I've got another collection that is maybe 2/3 to 3/4 finished, called Trigger Warning, which is a more politically focused collection. And some of that is starting to be published in magazines now, and that will come in a year or two. So I've been developing them side by side, but Homography sort of took over. I started writing this very queer focused stuff, and that was where my interest was drawing me. And I think I find that it was the same with Canute. Once your antennae are sort of up, I find that poems sort of land. You're more open to receiving poems if you're thinking in a certain way. If my focus is on queer ancestry, queer lineage, queer family, whatever, queer relationships, which is what Homography is focused on, then I was finding lots of ideas for those poems were coming to me. They're not at the moment because my focus is elsewhere, and I'm focused more on the political and natural world stuff is where the Trigger Warning focuses.
And as you said, the collection talks about communities, especially how coming out as gay can disrupt the family line in a way. You even describe it as an extinction event in one of the poems.
Yeah.
And how it then can lead to genealogies of a different kind. Can you say a bit more about this?
So the collection is dedicated to Sarah and all my sisters. So Sarah is not my sister, not genetically. She is my oldest friend from school, and we used to play an orchestra together. So she sat next to me. I'm an oboist and she's a flautist. And she was the first person I came out to. And I suppose that was the moment that I discovered chosen family, as opposed to genetic family, in that she was like, well, yeah, obvs, you're obvious, and was like, well, and, there was no, I mean, and also this is a long time ago. So her reaction, culturally, socially speaking, was, I couldn't have guaranteed it in a way which you could more now. This was early 90s, so we're still in a very different time. I'd only just left school. Section 28 was still very much there. We were still in the AIDS crisis. It was a very, very different time. The age of consent was still 21 at that point. It was a very different time to now. So she was my first sister. So I didn't have any sisters. There's a poem about this in the collection called Medusa Masseur. And I sort of gathered them over the years. And so that's a form of chosen family. And of course, I have queer family as well. People like Piero, who read at the launch, Piero Toto, that is, who's another So Poetry Sister. So I found that you could discover your own family, and there was not a complete ruction with my family in the way that some people experienced it at that time and earlier. But certainly there was quite a fault line that developed between me and my family. And I discussed that in the collection in various different ways. And the reactions in different parts of the family were different, but it did form a separation. And it took a long time to heal that and get over that. And other things that I discuss in the collection is how some of that is genetically inherited as well. There's a poet called Straight Shame, as opposed to Gay Pride, which talks about that sort of inheritance of shame that can come down through the generations and manifest in different ways. So I think as I got older, I realized that, for instance, my mother was carrying her own shame about something different to the shame that I had inherited, which was about queer stuff, and which made a big imprint and took a long time to work through. And it's not entirely worked through yet. It will probably be a lifetime's work to entirely work through it, because growing up gay, queer, whatever, in the 70s, 80s, early 90s, it left quite a heavy footprint. There was quite a lot to deal with and overcome. As an adult, I have gone off, and I really can't remember if I've answered your question or not, but you will point me in the right direction if I haven't.
Yes, you have.
I think something else I can say on that is, particularly when I got to London, I started meeting older queer people. So through my first boyfriend when I moved to London was a playwright called Tim Fountain. And he was a friend of Betty Bourne's, who was in the Blue Lips radical drag troupe. And there's a poem about Betty. We lost Betty about 18 months ago now. And there's a poem about Betty in the collection. And also, from the moment I discovered Derek Jarman, who Catherine introduced me to at art college, I was aware of sort of the queer elders, the queer pioneers who had forged the way for us, without whom we wouldn't have the freedoms that we at least currently enjoy here in this country. And I think that was heightened by meeting people by Betty. And that's another form of queer family, of understanding that we're all sort of part of a family tree. We're not literally related to each other, but we inherit things from each other. There's a poem about that called A Good Likeness in the collection, and about that previous generation particularly enabling the current ones. There's a poem called Old Queen's Ecosystem, which talks about that in the way that, like a tree, those older queer pioneers have created an environment for the rest of us to live in all the various forms that we now have.
And talking about these genealogies of other gay people who have come before us, the poems also document many aspects of gay culture, slang, places, there's a bit of Polari. Why was that an important part of your project?
Some of it is stuff that I'm just interested in. I'm interested in things like Polari. So the first poem is called Bold, which is Polari for queer, gay, homosexual, as in Kenneth Williams saying, "Oh, Winnie Bold," in is it Sandy and I forget the name. Round the Horn is the name I'm looking for. Sandy was one of the characters. So the language that gay men particularly used to speak to each other as a sort of code when it wasn't safe to speak openly. I'm interested in history, or certain aspects of history, or how that's manifests in the present. So there's a poem about the Vauxhall Tavern in the collection, which talks about the layers of history of that building. And even before that building was built, when the pleasure garden stood there in Vauxhall, and that was also a place that had a queer element to it, in that rent boys worked there, and there were all these secret walkways and stuff where you could have illicit meets, and how that building became a queer pub, not by design but by osmosis, really, during the course of the 20th century. And I think it's important to remember and recognise these things, because these freedoms that we have now, well, they haven't always existed in my lifetime. They certainly weren't apparent in my childhood. In my childhood, another of the poems, which is called Bulbs, which is sort of about emerging from lockdown. It was written at the end of lockdown, but it's also about emerging from queer childhood and realizing, oh, I'm not the only one, because it can feel like that when you grow up in small town Britain, small town anywhere, possibly. Maybe not so much now because of the way that media connects us and because
Mm.
socially Western Europe at least is in a different place to where it was back then. But certainly to me, it felt like I was the only one at that point. So remembering and recognizing that those freedoms that have come in my adult life can be taken away again, and that we should recognize that they've been hard fought for, and that it's been a long journey to get those, and recognizing our forebears in history is important to that. And it's also important in the last poem in the collection, which is called A Gaylord's Prayer, which is a reclamation of something I myself was called in the playground in a not nice way, recognizing right back to antiquity that queer people have been part of society. We've always been there. It can seem like we're living in pretty dark times at the moment sometimes, and it's just recognizing that some of those people lived through much darker times and fought back against them, and that we can take courage and resolution from that.
Yeah, it's so important to see how others have dealt with political hardships before and
Mm-hmm.
social difficulties. You said earlier that you have a performance arts background, so I understand better already the answer to my follow-up question, which is how did you get involved in mixed media collaboration and what does it bring to your poetry?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say it's sort of a part of me, really. So, as I said right back at the beginning, writing has always been one of the things that I've done. I've always done music, so I started playing the piano when I was a kid, but later, when I was a teenager, I took up the oboe, and that was the one that I really played properly. So I still play with the London Gay Symphony Orchestra. So classical music is part of my life. I've played with that orchestra for almost 30 years. I know I was a musical prodigy and joined age 3. That's an important part of my life, and also the visual art. I studied fine art, so I've always made films. So they don't seem like separate things to me. They're all just parts of my practice. So when we made Threads, some of those poems in Threads had originally been lyrics on my debut album, Alienathan, which was recorded on a 4-track in my bedsit in around the millennium. Never released. I released it eventually 20 years later. So there was already music that kind of fitted with those lyrics. So when I started performing Threads, I started using some of that music in the performances of the Thread. I wasn't singing the songs, I was doing spoken word versions of the songs over the music. So just after lockdown, we were Incandescent were invited to do a poetry night above the Stag Theatre when it was still in Vauxhall under the arches there. And that was Bold. That was where our Bold Queer Poetry soiree began. So what you saw at the Poetry Cafe was a bit like a mini Bold, what we used to do at Bold. So Bold is what I would call a literary cabaret. As I said earlier, I ran off to join the cabaret. So I used to MC shows. So I mean, I'm a showman. That's just something I do. So it feels natural to me if I'm reading a poem to perform the poem. They get performed in different ways. Some of them get performed with music. So I did a few pieces at the launch with music. Some of them I will read in different voices in different ways. But I think that's how I write poems as well. I mean, one of the things that people are saying as they read the collection is that I think it's very unified in terms of, or pretty unified anyway, in terms of its themes and the various strands that it's dealing with, but it's not particularly unified in terms of its voice, in that lots of the poems are written in very different ways. There are some what you might call very trad poems that are actually written more or less in pentameter, in couplets. And some poems that are concrete poems that are written in the shape of a bulb or a tree, not a butt plug, as Joel Taylor said. So Joel Taylor edited the book And you know, that was the T.S. Eliot Prize winner's principal
I
feedback.
know.
Nathan, do you know that most of your poems are in the form of butt plugs? I think they're written on the page in different voices, and sometimes literally in that they're written in character, if you will, like Old Queen's ecosystem is written from another perspective that isn't my own. The poem about the tavern is it's in quite a big style, and it's sort of almost in the voice of that building or the voice of history, queer history, maybe. Um, so integrating them when I do an event, it feels natural to me to integrate them into a show. And I think when Bold was running all the time, and all being well, it will be back next year. That was our USP. It was a cabaret, but it was poetry. It was serious poetry that was being performed, but it might have a video backdrop, or it might have some music, or it might just be, you know, we had Joelle and Andrew Macmillan and John McCulloch and all of those big queer poets perform, and they didn't do any of that, but I would frame them in that way. So it felt like a cabaret. The audience would be sat around cabaret tables. It would have that sort of vibe to it. People would say that it felt sort of like a community event, in that it was a social event, it was inclusive. People felt welcome there in a way that not all literary events do, but also it felt quite sort of showbiz in a way that I would say that spoken word events usually do feel welcoming and community, but they can often also feel a bit rough around the edges as well. So it sort of sat somewhere between those things.
You started Incandescent with Justin. How long ago was that, and what was the motivation behind it?
Well, 10 years ago, we were making our first book. So it was published 10 years ago this September. And the motivation was we'd basically got fed up with gatekeepers, really, saying no. I mean, I'm sure you've experienced this. I know all my poet friends experience it, that, you know, there's a lot of competition to get. It's not just poetry. At that time, I was trying to get a feature film screenplay green lit, and that was a big order, and I never managed in the end. We wanted to take the power into our own hands to make something, to make this book. So that's what we did. And then having done that, we wanted to use that power, those tools that we'd learned, to then publish other underrepresented writers. Mainly that focus has been on queer writers, LGBTQ plus writers, but also our mainstream anthology focused on black and brown writers, LGBTQ plus writers, and working class writers. Is always underrepresented writers, to give opportunity to people who might not otherwise get that opportunity. I mean, a case in point, I mean, you wouldn't think this would be the case, but we've just published Martin Sherman's memoir in September. Martin Sherman, best known for being the writer of Bent, which premiered at the Royal Court in 1979, starring Ian McKellen, and has been on at 60 countries throughout the world. For me, I think is one of the most important plays of the late 20th century. He couldn't get his memoir published. All the
Wow.
publishing houses turned it down because it was about the dollar signs, you know, that you wouldn't make enough money from doing it. And also, he's not Ian McKellen. So Ian wrote the foreword to the book, but he's not a household name. So he's a behind the scenes sort of name. And I thought that was criminal, basically. I mean, it's a fantastic book as well. That someone who's such a culturally important figure within the current publishing landscape could not get their memoir published. We published it because, you know, we believed in it, and we believed that it was important to get it out there.
I'd like to hear one of your poems, if you're okay with that.
I am okay with that, and I have a copy just here. I've dressed to match said copy.
Perfect.
I'm like Madonna. I have an outfit for every album or collection. In this case, you mentioned about the extinction event earlier, so I'm going to read the poem in which that is mentioned 6 times. This is called My Mass Extinctions. The first arrived as asteroid across a playground. Gaylord. So suddenly and with such velocity that there was no opportunity to shy its trajectory. Tooth fairies and Father Christmases perished on impact. I was it. The second was volcanic as a virgin dream, unconcealable as pustules on teen skin. The annihilation of generations of convention came in hash clouds and basalt black combat. I owned it. The third rose as ocean or audience, pattering like rain for 40 nights and 40 days. I soaked it up, took them in twos or threes or more. Hurrah, my Noah was a hit. I smashed it. The fourth came in glaciation of meter and rhyme, routines, didum, contempts, comforting chime. New form, a challenge, I shoveled gold, reversed vertiginous expectation, I turned it around. The fifth is hypoxia of hope, slow failure of ambition, the yearly grind of inhibiting skeletons, flesh forsaking bone like Sunday mutton succumbing to gravity. I fight it, vainly. The sixth may be man-made, calculated as profits from tapped veins, as overdosing an ecosystem. We are it. And there is just one way out of this. Own it, fight it, turn it around.
Amazing, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's been a joy for me to discover your poetry with Magma, actually. That's when I wrote your first poem. And yeah, I loved it.
Thank you. Well, thank you for choosing it. I've been no, I mean that. I've been trying to get in Magma for some time, so it was great to finally be accepted.
Yeah, you're welcome. It was a pleasure. I want to thank Nathan again for doing this interview with me. I had a really great time talking to him about his poetry, and I will leave all of the relevant links to him and Incandescent Press in the description below. I hope you follow it up and buy his book. It's so important to support small presses and authors. Thank you so much for watching. I look forward to seeing you in the next video very soon. Bye!